e kore hoki e ngaro ia koe te mea hona. Whakahange iho tō wairua tapu, hei whakamā i ngā whakaro o mātou ngāko. Kia tino aroha ai mātou ki a koe, kia tika ai te whakanui i tō ingoa tapu, ko ihu karaiti hoki tō mātou ariki. Āmene. A reading from the book of 2 Samuel chapter 18 and beginning at verse 19. Then Zadok's son Ahimaaz said, "Let me run to the king with the good news that the Lord has rescued him from his enemies." "No," Joab told him, "it wouldn't be good news to the king that his son is dead. You can be my messenger another time, but not today." Then Joab said to a man from Ethiopia, "Go, tell the king what you have seen." The man bowed and ran off. But Ahimaaz continued to plead with Joab, "Whatever happens, please let me go too." "Why should you go, my son?" Joab replied. "There will be no reward for your news." "Yes, but let me go anyway," he begged. Joab finally said, "All right, go ahead." So Ahimaaz took the less demanding route by way of the plain and ran to Mahanaim ahead of the Ethiopian. While David was sitting between the inner and outer gates of the town, the watchman climbed to the roof of the gateway by the wall. As he looked, he saw a lone man running towards them. He shouted the news down to David, and the king replied, "If he is alone, he has news." As the messenger came closer, the watchman saw another man running towards them. He shouted down, "Here comes another one." The king replied, "He also will have news." "The first man runs like Ahimaaz, son of Zadok," the watchman said. "He is a good man and comes with good news," the king replied. Then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, "Everything is all right." He bowed before the king with his face to the ground and said, "Praise to the Lord your God, who has handed over the rebels who dared to stand against my lord the king." "What about young Absalom?" the king demanded. "Is he all right?" Ahimaaz replied, "When Joab told me to come, there was a lot of commotion, but I didn't know what was happening." "Wait here," the king told him. So Ahimaaz stepped aside. Then the man from Ethiopia arrived and said, "I have good news for my lord the king. Today the Lord has rescued you from all those who rebelled against you." "What about young Absalom?" the king demanded. "Is he all right?" And the Ethiopian replied, "May all of your enemies, my lord the king, both now and in the future, share the fate of that young man." The king was overcome with emotion. He went up to the room over the gateway and burst into tears. And as he went, he cried, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Word soon reached Joab that the king was weeping and mourning for Absalom. As all the people heard of the king's deep grief for his son, the joy of that day's victory was turned into deep sadness. They crept back into the town that day as though they were ashamed and had deserted in battle. The king covered his face with his hands and kept on crying, "Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Then Joab went to the king's room and said to him, "We saved your life today and the lives of your sons, your daughters, and your wives and concubines. Yet you act like this, making us feel ashamed of ourselves. You seem to love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that your commanders and troops mean nothing to you. It seems that if Absalom had lived and all of us had died, you would be pleased. Now go out there and congratulate your troops, for I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a single one of them will remain here tonight. Then you'll be worse off than ever before." So the king went out and took his seat at the town gate, and as the news spread throughout the town that he was there, everyone went to him. Meanwhile, the Israelites who had supported Absalom fled to their homes. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Thanks be to God. I wonder if you've ever heard of buyer's remorse. Buyer's remorse is when you buy something thinking it'll be good, and later on it turns out that it's rubbish. And of course, remorse is one of those feelings where you find that normally something you intended to do, that you wanted to do, a course of action that seemed good to you, turns out later on to have been one that leaves you feeling deeply distressed, and you wish you could turn back time. You wish you could go back and not do the thing that you did. You wish that you could go back and say something, perhaps to somebody who's now gone forever. You wish that you could go back and do something that would change the course of your life now. Remorse is one of those emotions that we all know what it's like to experience. And it's a particularly distressing thing because we're aware that there is a gap between what we could have done, ought to have done, wish we had done, and where we are now. And now the consequences of David's failings all come home to roost at once. And it turns out now that he can't even mourn, because if he does, his own remorse is going to cause a further disaster to pile on top of the disasters that he can't avoid and go back and change. David finds himself here having lost his son, but in his remorse he nearly loses everything else as well. And strangely enough, it's Joab, the one who's been the instrument of evil, who sees what's the good that needs to happen here. It's Joab who gives him finally some good advice to follow up on all the wrong that he's done on David's behalf. Joab's been quite clever here. He's the one who instructs the messenger not to go, the favoured one. He's trying to save this guy from meeting the fate of the messenger who brought the news of Saul's death to David. And actually Ahimaaz decides to only share part of the story with David, not the really bad news. He leaves the risky business of telling David up to somebody else. But the really striking thing here is that David experiences now, finally, the full effects of all of his sin. His sins of action, of committing adultery with Bathsheba, his sin of murdering Uriah, and his sin of failing to be a judge between his children. He experiences now the grief that one wonders if he could have had when Nathan first confronted him. When he was first told, "You have done wrong." The grief that could have confronted him when he first recognised that his children were acting in ways that were wrong. And yet here, finally, he experiences grief when it's all too late for that grief to have any effect. And I wonder if most of us can resonate in some way with the grief of wrongdoing finally affecting us when it's too late to do anything about it. I want to encourage you that if you're on a pathway that leads you on the same path as David, the path to do something that's wrong, to commit some kind of offence of immorality, to some kind of harm against another person, to fail to take up your responsibilities if you're choosing, like David, whether to judge or not. Can I urge you to feel David's grief here and to sympathise with him and let it affect your actions now before it is too late. But I also want to give a word of comfort to you that if this story here has meant that you are remembering some past grief of wrongdoing or of failure to act, and you're again feeling David's grief here because it speaks to you personally, I want to encourage you this morning to take special note of David's words at the end of chapter 18. He says, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you." David's grief here has no effect, but we follow a different king, a new and better king. Jesus, who said, not, "I wish I'd done differently," but Jesus who says, you know what? Actually, all of these situations are beyond the power of people to rescue. I will die for you. David wishes that he had done differently, perhaps even sacrificed his life if that's what it took, in order to rescue his son Absalom. Of course, that was precisely the advice he took. Don't go out to safeguard your son Absalom in case you get killed. Now he goes, I wish I had gone out and sacrificed myself so that my son would have lived. Jesus says, you know what? I won't sit on the sidelines. Jesus says, I won't safeguard my own life. In fact, knowing that he would die, God became incarnate in the Son and sacrificed himself so that we could live. Even though we're just as guilty as Absalom of rebellion against our great King, God himself. Jesus does what David in retrospect wished he had done. And don't we praise God for that? When we see our own failings, when we see the failings of leaders in our countries, in the church, we give thanks that our leader did not withhold himself from danger, but went into danger, that Jesus suffered death for us, and because of that we are set free. Set free from the guilt and the shame of our own past failings. Set free from the remorse that sometimes strikes at us and says, I wish I had done differently. Set free to live now in the light of Jesus' sacrifice and to give ourselves over and over again and sacrifice for others so that they too can be set free from the remorse and pain of sin and set free from the power of sin so that they don't have to experience remorse and guilt again. Isn't that good news? As we read this sobering story, we recall the joyful story of the death of our King, Jesus. I runga I te ingoa o te matua te tama me te wairua tapu. Āmine. Let's continue in prayer in the collect for strength. Ki inoi tātou. E hoa, e tō mātou matua i te rangi, ko koe te atua kārawa ora tonu. Nāu mātou I whakaora a taia noa tia te timatanga o tēnei rā. Māu māta mea kaha, mātou e tiaki ai nei. Kaua hoki mātou e tukua kia taka I tēnei rā ki te hara. Kia rere rānei ki roto ki te mate. Engari, tohu ngia, whakatikaia e koe a mātou mahi katoa. Kia mea tonu ai mātou I ngā mea I tika ana ki tō titiro ko ihu karaiti nei hoki tō mātou ariki. Āmine. We say together the grace. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te atawhai o tō tātou ariki o ihu karaiti. Me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhi ngā tahitanga ki te wairua tapu, ake. Āmine. Kia pai o koutou rā, kia ora tātou.